Senior intelligence analyst Vrixton sat in his observation chamber aboard the collective survey vessel, his 4 eyes scanning the holographic display before him. For 3 standard cycles, he had been assigned to study the species known as humans. His superiors in the galactic collective had demanded a complete psychological and cultural profile before first contact could be established. What Vrixton had discovered over these cycles had left him deeply troubled. The collective operated on principles that had governed advanced civilizations for millions of years. Authority was absolute. Hierarchy was sacred. Those who held power did so because the natural order demanded it. Every species the collective had encountered followed this universal truth. Leaders commanded. Citizens obeyed. Progress moved forward through order and structure. But humans were different. Terrifyingly different. Vrixton pulled up a file labeled Cultural Heroes and began reviewing his notes for the 100th time. His preliminary report was due in 12 hours, and he still could not believe what his research had revealed. The humans did not simply tolerate those who challenged authority. They celebrated them. They built statues to honor them. They taught their children to admire them. They made entertainment about their lives and struggles. "Computer," Vrixton said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Display file. American Revolution." The holographic screen flickered and showed images of humans from several centuries ago. Men in strange clothing. Documents with elaborate writing. Battles fought with primitive weapons. Vrixton had studied this event extensively. A group of humans had decided they no longer wished to follow their designated rulers. Instead of accepting punishment for such thoughts, they had fought. They had won. They had won. And now, centuries later, those rebels were considered founding heroes of one of the most powerful nations on the planet. Vrixton made a note in his report. Subject species demonstrates pattern of celebrating successful rebellion against established authority. This behavior is not isolated, but appears consistent across all regional cultures and historical periods. He switched to another file. This one contained information about a human named Spartacus, a slave who had raised an army against his masters. He had failed in his rebellion and died a brutal death. Yet humans still spoke his name with admiration. They had created multiple entertainment productions about his life. They used his name as a symbol of resistance. Even their failures were celebrated if they had challenged authority with enough courage. Vrixton felt his scales tighten with anxiety. He had served the collective for 40 years. He had analyzed dozens of species. None of them had displayed this characteristic. The collective itself had maintained perfect order for over 10,000 years because every member species understood that challenging authority led only to destruction. "Computer," he said again. "Display file. French Revolution." More images appeared. Humans storming buildings. Humans executing their own leaders in public. Humans tearing down symbols of authority and replacing them with new ones. The disorder had lasted years. Millions had died. Yet when Vrixton had scanned human educational databases, he found that many humans viewed this event as a positive turning point in their history. They had killed their king. They had destroyed their nobility. They had created chaos that consumed an entire continent. And they called it progress. Vrixton stood from his seat and walked to the observation window. Below him, the blue and green planet rotated slowly in space. It looked peaceful from this distance, beautiful, even. But he now understood that the surface held a species whose very nature contradicted everything the collective believed. He returned to his workstation and began compiling more evidence. There was a human female named Rosa Parks who had refused to give her seat to someone of higher social status. This single act of defiance had sparked a massive movement that changed her entire society. Humans did not punish her memory. They honored her. They named buildings after her. They taught their children that her defiance was good and right. There was a male named Gandhi who had challenged the authority of an empire through peaceful resistance. He had been arrested, He had been beaten. He had encouraged others to accept punishment rather than obey unjust commands. And when his movement succeeded, he became one of the most respected figures in human history. There was Nelson Mandela, imprisoned for decades for opposing his government. When he was finally released, his people made him their leader. The very authority he had challenged was handed to him because his challenge had proven him worthy. Brixton found his hands trembling as he typed. The pattern was undeniable. Human society did not simply produce rebels as occasional aberrations. The entire species seemed designed to question, to challenge, to push back against any authority that they deemed unworthy. And the most disturbing part was how they determined worthiness. An authority was worthy only if it could justify itself to those beneath it. This concept was so foreign to collective thinking that Brixton struggled to even express it in proper terms. In the collective, authority existed because it existed. The High Council ruled because they were the High Council. The regional governors commanded because they held the position of regional governor. Questioning why was not simply forbidden. It was unthinkable. But humans asked why constantly. Their children asked why. Their students asked why. Their workers asked why. And if the answer was not satisfactory, they felt justified in refusing to comply. Brixton pulled up entertainment files next. He had initially dismissed these as irrelevant to his analysis. Now he understood they were perhaps the most important evidence of all. Human entertainment was filled with stories of individuals challenging authority. Their heroes were not loyal servants who followed orders without question. Their heroes were the ones who said no, the ones who stood alone against powerful forces, the ones who decided that their own judgment mattered more than the commands of their superiors. He found stories of soldiers who disobeyed orders to protect innocent lives. The humans considered these soldiers heroic. He found stories of workers who exposed corruption in their own organizations. The humans called them brave. He found stories of scientists who challenged established beliefs despite pressure from authorities. The humans celebrated them as pioneers. In collective society, such individuals would be removed. Their memories would be erased from all records. Their families would be marked for additional surveillance. The very suggestion that an individual might know better than authority was treated as a dangerous infection that must be contained. Humans built museums to such individuals. Brixton began a new section in his report, Implications for First Contact. He wrote carefully, knowing his words would shape collective policy for decades to come. Human society operates on principles fundamentally incompatible with collective governance. Their cultural celebration of authority-challenging individuals is not a surface trait, but appears deeply embedded in their psychological and social structures. This analyst believes that any attempt to integrate human society into standard, collective frameworks would result in immediate and widespread resistance. He paused, considering his next words. Furthermore, this analyst believes that humans may prove resistant to conventional authority establishment protocols. Standard introduction of collective governance typically relies on species recognizing the superior position of collective representatives and accepting their role in the natural order. Humans do not appear to recognize any natural order of authority. They believe authority must be earned through demonstrated competence and moral standing. They reserve the right to withdraw compliance if these standards are not maintained. Brixton felt a cold fear spreading through his body as he wrote the next paragraph. Most concerning is the human response to failed challenges against authority. In collective species, failed rebellion results in the discrediting of rebellious behavior. Survivors learn that resistance is futile and order is restored. Humans display the opposite response. Failed rebellions often increase admiration for rebellious behavior. Martyrs become more powerful symbols than living rebels. This suggests that conventional suppression tactics would not only fail but might strengthen human resistance. He sat back and stared at his report. 40 years of service. dozens of species analyzed. Never had he encountered anything like this. The collective had conquered thousands of worlds through a simple formula: demonstrate superior power, establish authority, integrate population into hierarchical structure. The system worked because all species eventually accepted the natural order of things. The strong commanded. The weak obeyed. Resistance faded as populations recognized the futility of challenging superior force. But humans did not believe resistance was futile. They believed resistance was noble. They believed that challenging authority, even when that challenge failed, was one of the highest expressions of their nature. Brixton thought about the collective fleet. Thousands of warships, millions of soldiers. Technology that could crack planets and extinguish stars. By any objective measure, human civilization was no match for collective power. But for the first time in his career, Brixton wondered if objective measures of power were enough. If the collective invaded Earth and established authority through force, what would happen? Based on his analysis, the humans would resist. They would fight. Many would die. But the survivors would tell stories about those who had challenged the collective. They would build monuments to the fallen. They would teach their children that defiance was honorable. And eventually, some human would stand up and challenge collective authority. Maybe they would fail. But failure would only create more martyrs, more stories, more cultural reinforcement of rebellious values. The cycle would continue forever. Brixton began his final recommendation. This analyst recommends extreme caution in approaching human civilization. Conventional integration is not advisable. Suggested alternatives include long-term observation without contact, diplomatic engagement as equals rather than superiors, or complete avoidance of the species until further analysis can be conducted. He paused and added one more line. Under no circumstances does this analyst recommend attempting to establish traditional, collective authority over human populations. The psychological and cultural traits identified in this analysis suggest that humans are uniquely suited to resist hierarchical control. Their celebration of authority-challenging individuals means that every act of suppression would generate new symbols of resistance. This species cannot be conquered through conventional means. They must be either avoided or treated as partners. Brixton transmitted his report and leaned back in his seat. His superiors would not be pleased. The collective had not treated any species as equals in 10,000 years. The very suggestion would be seen as weakness. But Brixton knew what he had discovered. He had found a species that did not simply fight against authority when they believed it was wrong. They had built their entire civilization around the idea that challenging authority was good. They raised their children to question. They celebrated their rebels. They honored their martyrs. The collective had conquered many species through superior force, but they had never encountered a species where defeat only strengthened the will to resist. Brixton looked out at Earth one more time. Such a small planet. Such a young species. Yet he knew in his heart that these strange creatures represented something the collective had never faced before. Not a threat that could be destroyed, but an idea that could not be killed. And ideas Brixton was beginning to understand were far more dangerous than any weapon.